The morning shift at Terminal B started like every other morning for the past 3 years. Same fluorescent lights humming overhead, same coffee stain on the security checkpoint counter, same endless stream of passengers shuffling through the metal detector with varying degrees of patience and annoyance. He stood behind the scanner, watching the monitor with practiced eyes. Shoes off, belt and bins, laptop separated from bags. The routine had become second nature, muscle memory that required no conscious thought. Just another face in the crowd of Transportation Security Administration officers, unremarkable in his navy blue uniform and standard issue badge. His name was Marcus Chun, though most passengers never bothered to read his name tag. To them, he was just another obstacle between their departure gate and their destination. Another uniformed figure asking them to remove their shoes, empty their pockets, and walk through the metal detector with their arms raised. Marcus had been working this checkpoint since 2019, hired after his discharge from the military. The job paid decent wages, offered health insurance, and most importantly, it was predictable. No surprises, no life or death decisions, no split-second choices that could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. He preferred it that while the early morning crowd consisted mostly of business travelers, their movements efficient and routine. They knew the drill, moved through security with minimal conversation, focus on catching their flights and starting their days. Marcus appreciated their professionalism, their understanding that everyone was just trying to do their job. Around 7:30 a.m., the pace began to pick up. More passengers, more bags, more opportunities for delays and complications. Marcus adjusted his position slightly, his eyes scanning the line ahead. A businessman in an expensive suit, a young woman with a guitar case, an elderly couple moving slowly but steadily toward the checkpoint. And then there was a Navy pilot. Marcus noticed him immediately, though not for any reason that would have been obvious to a casual observer. The man was tall, probably in his early 30s, with the kind of posture that spoke of military training. His uniform was pristine, his bearing confident but not arrogant. A standard Navy aviator, probably traveling between assignments or heading home on leave. Nothing unusual about that. Military personnel passed through the checkpoint regularly, and Marcus had processed hundreds of them over the years. They typically moved through security with the same efficiency as business travelers, understanding procedures and following them without complaint. But this pilot was different somehow. Marcus couldn't quite identify what set him apart initially. Perhaps it was the way he moved, with a fluid precision that suggested extensive training beyond standard military requirements. Or maybe it was his eyes, which seemed to catalog every detail of the security checkpoint with a kind of awareness that went beyond casual observation. The pilot places items in the bins with methodical care. Shoes, belt, jacket, phone, wallet. Each item positioned exactly where it needed to be. No wasted motion, no hesitation. His carry-on bag was packed with military precision. Everything in its designated place. "Sir, please step to the metal detector," Marcus said, his voice carrying the same professional tone he'd used thousands of times before. The pilot nodded and moved forward, arms raised in a familiar position. As he passed through the detector, Marcus glanced at the monitor out of habit, then back at the man walking through. That's when he saw that on the pilot's left wrist, just visible beneath the cuff of his uniform sleeve, was a small tattoo. Most people wouldn't have noticed it, wouldn't have recognized its significance even if they had. But Marcus wasn't most people that IT was a trident. Not just any trident, but the specific design that belonged to one very particular group of warriors. The Navy SEAL trident, also known as the Budweiser, a symbol that could only be earned through one of the most grueling training programs in the world. A symbol that represented capabilities and experiences that few could imagine.
Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Thumbs up, you can help more people hear this story by liking this video. Bell, every week we share unforgettable stories of silent heroes.
Marcus felt his breath catch slightly. His own left wrist, hidden beneath his TSA uniform sleeve, bore a similar mark. Faded now, the ink softened by years and weather, but still clearly visible to those who knew what to look for. The pilot cleared the metal detector without incident and moved toward the collection area to retrieve his belongings. Marcus watched him, noting the way he moved, the unconscious habits that spoke of training that went far beyond standard naval aviation. For a moment, their eyes met. The pilot paused, his hand reaching for his shoes. Something in Marcus's expression must have registered because the man's gaze sharpened slightly, focusing with the kind of intensity that comes from years of life-or-death situational awareness. Marcus realized he was staring and quickly looked away, focusing on the next passenger in line. But he could feel the pilot's eyes on him, studying, evaluating, trying to place what he'd seen in Marcus's face. The next few passengers passed through routine security screenings. A businessman with a laptop that needed additional screening, a woman whose jewelry set off the metal detector twice, a family with young children who needed extra time to organize their belongings. Marcus processed each of them professionally, but his attention kept drifting to the pilot, who was now sitting in the departure area just beyond the checkpoint, ostensibly checking his phone, but actually watching the security station. During a brief lull in passenger traffic, Marcus's supervisor approached. "Everything okay, Chin?" Supervisor Williams asked, following Marcus's gaze toward the departure area. "You seem distracted." "Just keeping an eye on things," Marcus replied, which was technically true. Williams nodded and moved on to check other stations. Marcus returned his attention to the checkpoint, but he could still feel the pilot's presence, still sense that he was being observed and evaluated. 20 minutes later, during another brief pause in the passenger flow, the pilot approached the checkpoint again, not to go through security. He was already in the secure area, but to speak with Marcus directly. "Excuse me," the pilot said, his voice carrying the confidence of someone accustomed to command. "I think we might have served together." Marcus looked up from the monitor he'd been pretending to study. Up close, the pilot's bearing was even more impressive. This wasn't just military training. This was something more specialized, more intensive. "I don't think so," Marcus replied carefully. "I would have remembered." The pilot smiled slightly. "Maybe not directly, but we might have some mutual acquaintances." He extended his hand, and as Marcus shook it, the pilot's thumb brushed against Marcus's wrist, just above where the TSA uniform sleeve ended. The touch was brief, casual, but Marcus knew it was intentional. "Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison," the pilot said, introducing himself formally. "Naval Special Warfare." Marcus felt his pulse quicken. Naval Special Warfare was the official designation for the SEAL teams. This wasn't just any Navy pilot. This was a SEAL who also happened to be qualified to fly. "Marcus Chun," he replied, keep his voice steady. "TSA." Morrison nodded, but his eyes conveyed that he understood there was more to Marcus's story than his current job title suggested. "I noticed your situational awareness," Morrison said quietly. "The way you read people, the way you process information, that's not standard TSA training." Marcus glanced around the checkpoint, ensuring their conversation wasn't drawing attention from other passengers or his supervisor. "I take my job seriously." "I'm sure you do," Morrison replied, "but I'm also sure that's not the whole story." For a moment, neither man spoke. The usual airport sounds continued around them, announcements over the intercom, the hum of conversation, the rolling of luggage wheels on the terminal floor. But between Marcus and Morrison, there was a different kind of communication happening. Morrison leaned slightly closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Team 6. Marcus's reaction was subtle but unmistakable. A slight tightening around his eyes, a barely perceptible shift in his posture. To anyone watching casually, it would have looked like nothing more than a TSA officer having a brief conversation with a passenger. But Morrison saw it, and Marcus knew he'd seen it. "I have a flight to catch," Marcus said finally, though he made no move to end the conversation. Morrison nodded. "So do I, but maybe we could continue this conversation sometime. When you're not working." He reached into his wallet and pulled out a business card. Not his official Navy card, but something else. A plain white card with only a phone number printed on it. "If you ever want to talk about old times," Morrison said, placing the card on the counter where Marcus could reach. "Or if you ever get tired of the routine here." Marcus looked at the card but didn't pick it up immediately. "I'm not sure what you think you know about me." "I know enough," Morrison replied. I know that someone with your skills and training is probably not completely satisfied scanning bags and checking IDs. I know that once you've operated at certain levels, civilian life can feel limiting. You don't know anything about my civilian life, Marcus said, but there was less conviction in his voice than before. Morrison smiled. You're right, I don't. But I know what mine felt like before I found my way back to the teams. He checked his watch. I really do need to catch my flight, but that number will reach me anytime, day or night. If you ever want to talk about possibilities. Morrison picked up his carry-on bag and started walking toward his departure gate. After a few steps, he turned back. By the way, he said, his voice carrying just far enough for Marcus to hear. Nice work on the Kandahar operation. Word travels, even in our community. And then he was gone, disappearing into the crowd of passengers heading to their gates. Marcus stared after him, his mind racing. The Kandahar operation wasn't something that appeared in any public records. It wasn't something that would be discussed in ordinary military circles. Knowledge of that mission was limited to a very small group of people, all of whom had been sworn to secrecy. The fact that Morrison knew about it meant he was exactly who he claimed to be, and that he had access to information that confirmed Marcus's own background. Marcus picked up the business card, examining it. Just a phone number, nothing more. But somehow it felt heavier than it should have, weighted with possibilities and implications he wasn't sure he was ready to consider. The next passenger was approaching the checkpoint, and Marcus forced himself to focus on the present. But throughout the rest of his shift, his mind kept drifting back to Morrison's words, to the recognition in the pilot's eyes, to the suggestion that there might be alternatives to spending the rest of his career watching people walk through metal detectors. During his lunch break, Marcus sat in the employee break room, staring at the card Morrison had left behind. He'd been out of the teams for 4 years now, officially retired due to injuries sustained during a classified operation. The physical wounds had healed, but the emotional and psychological ones had taken longer to process. He'd thought he was done with that life. The constant deployments, the life or death decisions, the weight of responsibility for outcomes that could affect national security. The TSA job had offered stability, predictability, a chance to serve his country in a different way without the intense pressure of special operations. But if he was being honest with himself, he missed it. He missed the challenge, the sense of purpose, the knowledge that his skills and training were being used to their fullest potential. He missed working with people who understood the stakes, who operated at the same level of intensity and commitment. Marcus pulled out his phone and stared at Morrison's number. One call could change everything, or it could lead to nothing more than a conversation with someone who understood what he'd been through. After his shift ended, Marcus drove home to his small apartment, still thinking about the encounter. His living space was sparse but organized, everything in its place. Military habits died hard. Even in civilian life, he made dinner, watched the news, went through his usual evening routine. But Morrison's car remained on his kitchen counter, a constant reminder of possibilities he hadn't allowed himself to consider in years. That night, Marcus lay in bed staring at the ceiling, his mind racing. He thought about the missions he'd completed, the teammates he'd lost, the reasons he'd left the teams in the first place. He thought about the satisfaction he'd felt when everything came together perfectly, when his training and skills made the difference between success and failure. And he thought about the metal detector, the routine, the predictability that had been both a blessing and a curse. Around 2 a.m., Marcus made his decision. He got up, walked to the kitchen, and picked up his phone. The number rang 3 times before Morrison answered. "I was wondering when you call," Morrison said without preamble. "I'm not sure what I'm calling about," Marcus replied honestly. "That's okay. Most people aren't sure at first. Why don't we start with coffee?" They met the next morning at a small cafe near the airport, far enough from the terminal to avoid running into Marcus's co-workers, but close enough that the meeting wouldn't seem unusual. Morrison was dressed in civilian clothes, but his bearing remained unmistakably military. He was already seated when Marcus arrived, positioned with his back to the wall and a clear view of the entrance. "Thanks for coming," Morrison said as Marcus sat down across from him. "I'm still not sure why I'm here," Marcus replied, though he accepted the coffee Morrison had already ordered for him. "Because you're bored," Morrison said simply. "Because you're using about 10% of your capabilities in your current job. because you missed the work. Marcus didn't deny it. That doesn't mean I want to go back. Maybe not to the teams directly, Morrison agreed. But there are other options, other ways to use your skills. Morrison leaned forward slightly. What do you know about private security contracting? Enough to know it's not for me, Marcus replied. I didn't serve my country to become a mercenary. I'm not talking about mercenary work, Morrison said. I'm talking about continuing to serve your country, just in a different capacity. He pulled out a tablet and showed Marcus a series of photos. Government buildings, diplomatic facilities, high-value targets that required specialized security. There are threats that regular security can't handle, Morrison explained. Situations that require people with our specific training and experience. Not overseas, but here at home. Marcus studied the images. Domestic security, counterterrorism, threat assessment, protective services for high-value targets, working with federal agencies, but not as a federal employee. More flexibility, better pay, and the knowledge that you're still making a difference. Morrison showed him more information. Salary figures that were 3 times what Marcus made at the TSA. Benefits packages that rivaled military service. And most importantly, the chance to work with people who understood the stakes. Who would I be working for? Marcus asked. A private firm that contracts with various government agencies. All above board, all legal, all in service to national security. Morrison closed the tablet. I'm not asking you to decide right now, but I am asking you to think about it. To consider whether scanning bags and checking IDs is really how you want to spend the rest of your career. Marcus sipped his coffee, thinking, why me? There are plenty of former SEALs looking for work. Because you've proven you can adapt, Morrison replied. You've been successful in civilian life, which means you can handle the transition back to operational work. And because I've seen your file, your performance record speaks for itself. They talked for another hour, Morrison providing more details about the work, the expectations, the opportunities for advancement. By the time they parted ways, Marcus had agreed to think about it seriously. Over the next few days, Marcus found himself paying closer attention to the security checkpoint, analyzed it with the same critical eye he'd once applied combat zones. He noticed vulnerabilities, potential threat vectors, ways that someone with hostile intent could exploit the system. He also noticed how routine his work had become, how little mental engagement it required. After years of complex operations that demanded every ounce of his intelligence and training, the simplicity of the TSA job was beginning to feel stifling that a week later. Marcus called Morrison back. I'm interested, he said, but I have conditions. Name them. I want to know exactly what I'd be doing. No surprises. No gradual revelations about the nature of the work. I want full transparency from beginning. Agreed. And I want to be able to leave if it's not a good fit. No long-term contracts. No penalties for changing my mind. Also agreed. When do we start? Morrison's smile was audible through the phone. How about tomorrow? I'll pick you up after your shift. The next evening, Morrison drove Marcus to a nondescript office building in a nearby business district. The lobby was unremarkable, the kind of generic corporate space that could house any number of businesses. But the elevator required a key card to access the upper floors, and the security cameras were more sophisticated than they appeared at first glance on the 7th floor. Morrison led Marcus through a maze of offices and conference rooms to a corner office with a view of the city skyline. Behind the desk sat a woman in her 50s, professionally dressed with a kind of bearing that suggested extensive military or intelligence experience. Marcus Chun, she said, standing to shake his hand. I'm Sarah Collins, Director of Operations. Jake has told me a lot about you. All good, I hope, Marcus replied. Collins smiled. Your reputation precedes you. Please have a seat. Over the next 2 hours, Collins outlined the nature of the work Marcus would be doing. Threat assessment for government facilities, security planning for high-profile events, protective services for visiting dignitaries. All domestic, all legal, all in service to national security. The pay is excellent, Collins said, sliding a contract across the desk. The benefits are comprehensive, and the work is challenging enough to keep someone with your background engaged. Marcus read through the contract carefully. Everything Morrison had promised was there, including the flexibility to leave if the work wasn't a good fit. "What about my current job?" Marcus asked. "We'll handle the transition," Collins replied. 2 weeks' notice, professional references, everything above board. Your TSA supervisor will never know why you're really leaving." Marcus looked at the contract again, then at Morrison, then back at Collins. "When would I start?" "How about Monday?" That Friday was Marcus's last day at the TSA checkpoint. He went through his usual routine, but everything felt different. He found himself memorizing details, storing away memories of a chapter of his life that was ending. Near the end of his shift, a familiar figure approached the checkpoint. Morrison, in civilian clothes this time, carrying a small carry-on bag. "Going somewhere?" Marcus asked as Morrison placed his items in the security bins. "Just a short trip," Morrison replied. "Business meeting." As Morrison walked through the metal detector, Marcus caught a glimpse of his wrist. The trident tattoo was clearly visible, no longer hidden beneath a uniform sleeve. "Have a good flight," Marcus said, his voice carrying a double meaning that only Morrison would understand. Morrison nodded, collected his belongings, and headed toward the departure gates. But before disappearing into crowd, he turned back one more time. "See you Monday," he said, just loud enough for Marcus to hear. Marcus smiled and turned his attention to the next passenger in line. For the first time in years, he was looking forward to Monday morning. The following Monday, Marcus reported to the office building where he'd met Collins. His TSA uniform had been replaced by a business suit, but he carried himself with the same professional bearing he'd maintained at the checkpoint. The work was everything Morrison had promised: challenging, meaningful, and engaging in ways that his TSA job had never been. He found himself using skills he thought were permanently retired, applying training he'd assumed was no longer relevant to civilian life. But more than that, he was working with people who understood, people who had faced similar challenges, made similar sacrifices, and were now finding new ways to serve their country. 6 months later, Marcus stood in the same Terminal B where he'd worked for 3 years. But this time, he wasn't behind a metal detector. He was part of security detail for a visiting foreign dignitary, his trained eyes scanning the crowd for potential threats as he watched the flow of passengers through the checkpoint. He saw his former co-workers going through their routines, professional, dedicated, but limited by the constraints of their roles. Marcus thought about the day Morrison had walked through his metal detector, the recognition that had passed between them, the conversation that had changed the trajectory of his life. Sometimes, he reflected, the most important moments come disguised as routine encounters. A Navy pilot walking through security, a glimpse of a tattoo, a business card left on a counter. Small actions that can lead to significant changes. His radio crackled with an update from the security team. The dignitary's flight was on schedule, and they needed to move to the next checkpoint in their security protocol. Marcus adjusted his earpiece and followed his team leader through the terminal. As they passed the TSA checkpoint where he'd once worked, he caught the eye of one of his former colleagues, a young man who'd been hired just before Marcus left. The young man nodded respectfully, recognizing Marcus but not fully understanding the transformation that had taken place. Marcus nodded back, then continued with his team. He had work to do, important work that utilized his skills and training in ways that made a difference. And somewhere in the sky above, Morrison was probably flying another mission, still serving his country, still making split-second decisions that affected national security. The metal detector hummed quietly in the background, processing another endless stream of passengers. But Marcus was no longer listening to that particular rhythm. He had found a new beat, a new purpose, a new way to serve. The trident tattoo on his wrist, hidden beneath the suit sleeve, was no longer a reminder of what he used to be. It was a symbol of what he had always been: a warrior, a guardian, a protector. The job title might change, but the mission remained the same. As his team moved through the terminal, Marcus felt the satisfaction that came from using his abilities to their fullest potential. The routine was gone, replaced by the constant challenge of staying ahead of threats, of thinking like an adversary, of protecting people who would never know his name. IT was exactly where he belonged.